Hi everybody and welcome to this ending keynote. We have the honor to listen to Professor Dorothy Espelage. Dorothy Espelage is Professor of Psychology at the University of Florida. She's the recipient of the APA Lifetime Achievement Award in the Prevention Science and the 2016 APA Award for Distinguished Contribution to Research in Public Policy. She's also a fellow of APS, APA, and AERA. She earned her PhD in the counseling psychology from Indiana University in 1997. Over the last 20 years, she has authored over 200 peer-reviewed articles, 5 edited books, and 30, or was it 60, chapters on bullying, homophobic teasing, sexual harassment, dating violence, and gang violence. Her research focuses on translating empirical findings into prevention and intervention programming, and she has secured $6.5 million of external funding. So please let me introduce Dorothy Espelage.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to try to make this dynamic enough. I'm jet lagged, so we'll see. You never know where it's going to go, even when I'm not jet lagged, so we'll see. I am being videotaped, so I tend to keep it a little bit cleaner. Also, I tweeted Ariana Grande and invited her to this keynote and said if she can't make it, she can just send some tickets over. So if maybe she'll show up. So what I'm going to try to do now in the next 55 minutes is to talk about 22 years of research. And you should know that we can provide you, I'll provide you with this PowerPoint, so let's just spend this 55 minutes kind of listening to me, and I talk fast, so I apologize about that. There's a lot of text on the slides. Mostly, I'm not going to read from them. That's not what I do. But when you do get the PowerPoint, at least you'll know what the point I was trying to make. So there's text there. You can read along, or you can just kind of watch me. And I've done this a few times the last 20-some years. So. Again, 22 years of research, going to be 45 PhDs that I graduate next week, thousands of undergrads that have helped us do this work in the States. In addition to that, some really, really brave school administrators that have allowed me to do some of the work that's very challenging in the United States, which is a very socio-political context of doing this work of bullying and sexual harassment and challenging school-based work that a lot of what I'm going to talk about today we've already heard about in the session, so in some ways it's going to validate some of the experiences you have in other countries, the complexity of doing this type of work, the persistence that you need to do it, and sometimes doing some unsafe kind of topics. And so in our lab, we have done some really basic research over the last 20 years to identify risk and protective factors that need to be in prevention and intervention programs for bullying and other concomitant aggression, things of interest to us within the context of the United States. At the same time, we got to the point where, as someone has said in these sessions, we know enough about bullying and the overlapping aggression. We know enough about the risk and protective factors that we got to the point where we could start developing and evaluating prevention programs. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that we've tried to do in the States, in the schools, through a number of randomized clinical trials to address both bullying, homophobic name-calling, and sexual harassment. For me, I see that co-occurring. A lot of my work is grounded within kind of a gendered lens, an identity lens, and an intersectionality lens, which I think will be a contribution to this conference. At the same time, we've been very focused on special populations that are at particular risk for victimization. So that's students with disabilities, LGBT youth, now our immigrant population, our undocumented populations. It seems to be some of the moving targets that are of interest to us. At the same time, as many of you have said in these sessions, it's challenging to get schools to implement evidence-based programs. And when they do implement, it's often with limited fidelity and almost zero sustainability, right? So I'm going to speak truth to you. That's part of jet lag, that you just kind of, the screening ability just goes away. And so I already speak truth, but it's really heightened truth at this point. So what we've tried to do, and that'll be in the next steps, hopefully the last slide, is to understand how can we leverage technology to do some of this work such that we are not taking up classroom instructional time. And so we're supported heavily by the federal government to try to figure out, can we take some of these bullying prevention programs and deliver them through modalities and technologies that would be more efficient, that would kind of go where the kids are, that perhaps we should have bullying prevention programs that doesn't involve sitting next to your tormentor and doing role plays with them. And then also just being considerate of that we are so focused on taking the test, recovering from the test, and the academic tests and the standards and high stakes. Okay, so lots of things. We're not going to be able to cover the over 250 publications that we've been cranking on here. In 2011, so 2011 is going to be a very important year as we talk today. 2011, Tofty and Farrington meta-analysis came out and said that you guys were doing very well in Europe in reducing bullying to the tune of 17 to 23%. And somehow we thought that was beautiful, right? We come from North America where we didn't enjoy that 17% reduction, and in fact, our reductions are even smaller. So that wasn't necessarily a great finding for North America, but certainly did give some indication that if you had certain elements in bullying prevention across the social ecology, that you could get these reductions under ideal situations of implementation. 2011 also gave us the Durlac meta-analysis, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, that showed that social-emotional learning programs really could move the needle on disruptive behavior and also academic functioning and improve classroom kind of climate, if you will. Also in 2011, the United States, former President Obama, had the first White House on bullying. Several of you were in that place, where our president said he had been victimized because of his big ears, and therefore bullying became this heightened thing that all of a sudden in 2011, the United States are like, bullying is a problem. And people say that to me all the time. It's really a problem right now. And I say, well, it's kind of been a problem for a number of decades. We just have continued focused on it in 2011. However, what also happened in 2011 in the United States is bullying prevention became hyper-commercialized, right? And I'm sure it's happening in your country, all of the countries that you represent too. Everybody and their brother became an expert, right? If you're breathing and you ever went to school, you could be a bully prevention expert. If you're a parent and have kids, you're a bullying expert. If you're a former teacher, you could be an expert. And what was happening is the evidence that so many of you, everyone in here, my colleagues, my dear colleagues, which I'm just so thrilled to be on this stage with you, is that we had a lot of misperceptions that really caused us some issues in that many of the schools were being bombarded by those programs that were not evidence-based, and we had a lot of misperceptions, mostly because of the media. So when you do content analysis of most media representation of bullying, what do we find? About 80% of those cover the suicides associated with victimization. 10% of them cover your new legislation, and 10% cover prevention. Right, so we do all this great work around prevention, and yet all they want to do is highlight this kind of bully suicide. So we're left with a number of misperceptions. So I'm going to just take a few minutes to run many of these down. This idea that bullying is an epidemic, bullying is a public health concern, and we have now framed it that way in many, many countries, and we're concerned about that. But certainly bullying is not present in all of our schools. It is to a certain extent, but there's great variability in the rates of bullying. And you heard Patty talk about the big thing that's just hit the United States a couple days ago, that bullying is down in Baltimore schools. Bullying is not down in Baltimore schools, mostly because they didn't even survey students with disabilities, right? So you have a number of those special populations they didn't survey. So just know that, we still have bullying if you actually look at the populations that are most at risk. The bully-suicide link, we actually know that from meta-analyses that some of you have done in this room, that bullying is just one of a multitude of risk factors that is associated with depression and anxiety, and when you have limited access to mental health services, that depression and anxiety then has a risk for suicidal ideation and attempts. As someone that has done some expert witness cases with some of the suicide cases in the United States, when a lawyer says to me, Professor Espelage, can you tell me, is there a causal link between bullying and suicide? And I have to say no, right? Because the reality is it's not there. It's a host of risk factors that's associated with depression, anxiety, and feeling as a burden, and that contributes to suicidal ideation. So that's unfortunate, because now, at least some parents in the United States, when they get that call, if they get the call from the school that says that your child is being bullied, they instantly are concerned about suicidal ideation. That's how entrenched this has happened within the context from the media. Bullies need to be punished. Many of the folks in this room have studied peer dynamics. Many of you have contributed to this idea that there's heterogeneity in those kids that are engaged in high rates of bullying. We can think about late Phil Rotkin, who did some beautiful work around popular kids that engage in high rates of bullying. Some of our own work has shown that some of those kids, and Tracy Valancourt talks about the Machiavellian bully, right? Those kids that have high social capital and that really have this heightened theory of mind, if you believe some of Sutton's work out of the UK. And so there's also this notion, and we've continued to do this, that bullies need to be punished. So it was nice to hear some promising dialogue about restorative circles and practices. That's a very challenging thing to do because parents and often teachers feel that if we do any kind of restorative approaches around bullying and other forms of aggression or violence, then in fact we're letting the kids off the hook. So there's a pressure there. But I think in many of our North American countries where suspensions and expulsions are just too high, we're actually suspending kindergartners at a very, very high rate, that we're recognizing that we need to take a different approach. There's also this notion that bullies come from dysfunctional families. Again, the heterosexual, the kind of heterogeneity within the context of bullying, we know that they come from all walks of life, right? And we heard from the princess this morning that we have to pay attention to those kids that engage in perpetration as well, right? And so this last one is an interesting one, and Wendy, this is a Canadian researcher, okay, just so you know. This was out in the news last year that bullying is hardwired. Right, so why have this conference if it's just kind of hardwired? When in fact, this Canadian researcher was cross-sectional study, did not do any genetic marker and a genetic expression. Of course, I called the researcher and I was like, hey, let's have a little conversation about your paper. And she's like, yeah. I said, yeah. I said, have you heard of Mara Brigden? She's Canadian too. You might want to read her recent paper that showed that in fact your genetic expression is triggered if you're in classrooms where the injunctive norm is to be aggressive. She really, really appreciated that phone call. So, yeah, and she wasn't tenured. And so, anyway, I was nice about it. I was just a little bit concerned that she wasn't reading the extant literature. I'm going to talk a little bit. So what I'm going to try to do is just give you a sampling of the research that I've done for 22 years, because oftentimes I'm concerned that I might not be invited back. So I kind of just need to get it all out there. Right? So, because I go into some communities in the United States where they actually escort me out of town. So, I'm very cognizant that, I could present one study, but I'd prefer to give you a sampling. This is the definite, and again, I'm going to fly through some of this because some of this has been covered ad nauseum, if you will, at this conference. This is a research definition that we really did adopt largely from Oveus's definition, and then we spent 2 years in think tanks in the United States, and did we not, Wendy Craig? And we kind of came up with the same definition that Dan talked about years ago. And what we did do that was different, though, is we were able to convince the folks on the task force that we wanted to be able to put has a high likelihood of being repeated because of the developmental literature of Graham and others that have really showed that kids change their behavior when they're victimized, right? They don't take lunch, they drop out of sport, they drop out of scouts, they do other types of things, don't go down that hallway, right? So we were able to do this. There's one particular slide. What we've done is a disservice in some ways that we haven't experimentally manipulated the definition as much as we needed to over the years. We adopted definitions and didn't do really those kind of experiments that we needed to do. And this is a paper that came out in 2014, a lot of text there, and I'm just going to break it down for you very simply. When we went in, it was a nationally representative sample, 2 samples, and we asked kids and manipulated, we gave them a definition, and then we asked them to a certain extent of whether or not something was happening, they were being victimized, was it repeated, did they feel powerless, did they feel helpless? As we added those components, the daily interference increased. And so it does show some suggestion that the more of those components that we talk about of repetition and the power differential, we added helplessness and feeling like a burden, then we would have higher depression and anxiety. So there is some suggestion that this gradation of this definition is critical to the ways in which we think about bullying. I would encourage you, of anybody that's in your PhD students, that this is wide open for manipulating this definition. I'm to the point where I don't want to, I really do not want to debate this anymore, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to retire in 10 years and we're still going to go, what is bullying? Really? Okay. These are kind of our rates in the United States that have not really changed. So we're talking about 32% are either chronically victimized or ringleader bullies. And even some of Bob Ferris's social network stuff is showing that it's not really the ringleader bullies, it's the kids that want to work up the hierarchy that are engaging in these bullying perpetration. Our bully victims are about 8%. They're overrepresented in our depression, anxiety, and suicidality. And consistently, we've shown that even in meta-analysis. And in the United States, 60% of the bystanders, only 13% intervene to help the victim. And so that's a cause for concern. I just want to reiterate a number of folks. I think we've made it very, very clear here that face-to-face bullying is still prevalent more than online bullying. I think that was a consistent message, and this is just, again, the data from the United States that show that this is true. We also know that cyberbullied students are less likely to notify adult than face-to-face bully victims, and we know this because they will take the technology away. Right, so this is, again, I'm going to kind of just fly through some of this stuff. Now, I get a lot of pressure in the United States of, we have such a cyberbullying problem in our schools. Can you please help us? And I often say to administrators and teachers, because I actually spend a lot of time in schools, I'm like, if you actually focused on your face-to-face bullying, the in-school bullying, it would feel so omnipresent, just like the cyberbullying. But that doesn't go over well. See, we're good social scientists, so I go and I collect data. And so we tracked 5th, 6th, and 7th graders, and you're going to get to know this sample. This was funded by the Centers for Disease Control, largely looking at the connection between bullying and sexual violence, and ultimately teen dating violence, because we're concerned about violence across the lifespan. And so this is a longitudinal. I don't have to explain what longitudinal is here. This is beautiful. I got some researchers in here that are going to love that. So usually I'm talking to teachers and their eyes are about to roll back in their head, and I'm like, no, stay with me, please. This is important. So we track these kids over a 2-year period, and they're 6 months apart here. And we have the University of Illinois bullying perpetration scale that talks a lot about just kind of name calling, it's self-report, it's rumor spreading. It converges with peer nominations if people are concerned about whether or not this is actually measuring that. And what we see here is that across the 6 months, if in fact I am perpetrating bullying at school, face-to-face, 6 months later I'm going to do it online. And the scale at the bottom is Michelle Yabar's Growing Up with Media scale, cyberbullying perpetration. For those of you that love the root mean square error of approximation, the RMSEA, closer to 0 means beautiful, truth, and fit. It fits pretty nicely. So in fact, if you're a prevention scientist, what you want to do is you want to disconnect those arrows. Right? You want to, in fact, address face-to-face bullying within the context of the schools, and we hope that we cut that connection to cyberbullying over time. That's our ultimate goal, is it not? Okay. Now, this is even more beautiful, though, for those of you that love structural equation modeling, because they cross, right? And so what this means is that if, in fact, I'm chronically victimized at school, so I have high rates of bully victimization at school, 6 months later, I report perpetrating online. Now, if anybody spends any time in schools, I always talk about it, the Monday morning effect. No one in my lab ever goes to a school on Monday because you will sit in the office all day. Monday is the time that they were putting out all the damage that happened over the weekend. And it doesn't take, it takes me 2 minutes to explain the Monday morning effect to a principal. Usually what happens is there's victimization or there's drama. Something has played out at school on a Friday. It continues to play on the football court, the basketball court, online, over to the point where they've heard, maybe the administrators heard about it over the weekend, and it's right on their desk in the office on Monday morning. If in fact, and this is what we need to convince our administrators of, is that if in fact you're addressing the face-to-face bullying, there's a high likelihood that when the kids engage in social media or engage in technology, that mean and cruel behavior will not spill over. This is what we have to believe based on both the prevalence and based on the fact that these are overlapping. Okay. I have fought the fight to get folks to understand that bullying, as we define it, as we talk about it, has been void of gender, of identity, of all of the other types of things that contribute to this. And so I've spent a number of years, funded again by the Centers for Disease Control, because I've convinced them that through our basic research that, wait a minute, when I interview kids, and I'm talking about bullying, kind of like name calling, all the rumor spreading and this kind of stuff, and when I have a 7th grader stop me, an 11-year-old, and say, and this is how they talk to me, they say, "Excuse me, lady, I really appreciate your questions, but you're really not getting to what really upsets me on a daily basis in this middle school." And I'm like, what is this? This was 2000. Being called fag and gay 100 times a day, when in fact all I want to do is pay my wee. I don't even know what I'm attracted to. And the fact that maybe it's not directed toward me, but it's all over the place, and it just creates a hostile environment. And this is a 7th grader. So I turned to Paul Poteet, who's now a super famous professor in the United States, and I said, what do you think about that? And he was like, let's develop a scale called the Homophobic Content Agent Target Scale, HCAT. And since 2000, we started to study this, right? Because no one was talking. Yeah, Ian Rivers was talking about it in the UK. Michael Kimmel, the beautiful sociologist, was saying, you know, that schools are the breeding grounds for violence against women. But most of the bully researchers didn't want to touch it. They were either in a state where they couldn't ask the question, like Nebraska. Can't ask that question in Nebraska. You ask them anything about homophobic name calling or sexual orientation, they might, you know, think, wait a minute, I might be gay. Wait a minute, right? And so they didn't want to touch that, but we had to demonstrate that, in fact, it was something unique. That, in fact, this benign, and it's not benign, but this garden variety bullying. At the same time, we had Nan Stein at Wellesley writing the first book on the sexual harassment in K through 12 settings. And so you take the sociologist's work and some of the work we're started to do, and we started to develop some kind of models around this. Again, longitudinal data. I want to show here, oftentimes what we do before latent class became like the thing, we had this thing called cluster analysis that we all liked just fine. And so we cluster analyzed our bullying scale because I want to demonstrate that in some of our studies, 30 to 50% of the bullying that we were seeing were homophobic in nature. 30 to 50%. Yet we were almost no one was talking about this in the context of the bullying work in the United States and many other countries as well. When we do this, you get about 12% of males and 12% of females that are reporting high rates of bullying, whether it's name calling, rumor spreading. That was kind of devoid of the gender piece. Look what happens when we cluster analyze the homophobic content agent target scale. And what we do is we ask middle school kids, in the last 30 days, how many times have you called someone, the following people, fag, dyke, homo? And in more recent years, we've had to add no homo, right? Because and they changed the terminology. And we say friend, non-friend, because a lot of this is bantering among friends. Someone you thought was gay, someone you didn't know that was gay, and someone you didn't like. When we cluster analyze, it's 1 out of 3 boys are reporting this in high rates. And we're talking about 60 times a month. And I would suggest that that's just where the ceiling was for that particular cluster. Females also engage in this, and I was trying to rest upstairs, but I was on Twitter, and I was actually watching all of your sessions from my hotel room. And there was someone had a session on sexual harassment, and they were talking about the policing of masculinity. And we find when we do follow-up focus groups with this data that actually the girls contribute to that policing of masculinity in our schools. You step out of that gender box, as much as you don't like the gender box, you will be attacked by both males and females. Okay, is that not beautiful? Everybody appreciates this in here. And thank you, Todd Little, for helping me with this CFA. This is important because I was trying to publish my work on bullying and homophobic name-calling, and the reviewer said, isn't it just one thing? Clearly, they did not take any gender studies or any kind of feminist thing or don't even remember middle school, right? So we have to demonstrate through a CFA that, in fact, if you fit a one factor with bullying and homophobic name-calling together, it doesn't fit. They are two distinct constructs, and we see over time, we have measurement and variance across over time, but they also are highly predictive and they're causally related, as strong as we can get causally related in social science. And again, for the REMC, it's beautiful, 0.051. Now, I argue that a lot of these are fitting really beautifully because we have theory. Thank you, Michael Kimmel. Thank you, Nan Stein. Thank you for the work of Donna Eder, who sat in middle schools and observed this behavior, Anthony Pellegrino. Okay, then we wanted to take it a step further. Because in our country, what was happening during the Bush administration, it was a long 8 years, and there was no sex happening in the United States at that point. And I'm Catholic, so there's a lot of immaculate conception going on. And so at the point, we could not do rape prevention. We could not do anything that was related to sexual harassment work in the schools. But you could go in with pressurous sexual assault dollars and talk to them about bullying prevention. And principals are like, yes, please come in and help me with my bullying problem. The minute you say, I'm going to help you with your rape or sexual assault problem, they're like, there's the door, right? And so we had to show, so I called CDC, because I just have them on speed dial. And I was like, do you understand what is happening with your rape prevention education across this country? And they're like, no. And I was like, yeah, they're doing bullying prevention. And they were like, well, is there any support that if we reduce bullying, that somehow that's going to reduce sexual assault? And I said, yeah, there's actually 5 studies, one in Brazil, one in Minnesota, one in California. I think the Canadians have done something up there, right? And then there was a 5th paper. So we started to do this work, and we actually found, and this was across 2.5 years, that if bullying escalates to sexual harassment. Sexual harassment among 10 through 12-year-olds, just so you know, is not sexual assault and rape. 1 to 3% of our middle school students have experienced a sexual assault and rape. I know that should be 0, but it's 1 to 3, hard to model. What it is unwanted sexual commentary and sexual rumor spreading, and now we're going to the online version of that, which you're seeing here in Sweden. Now, the take-home message here is homophobic name-calling is prevalent. If you are doing bullying prevention work with, and I would say in most of the countries where my colleagues are doing this work, homophobic name-calling is, and it made my entire career when this conference was opened with a discussion on homophobic name-calling, I just want to say, right? That would not have happened 10 years ago. So this is beautiful that we're having these conversations and we opened with it. It's quite prevalent if you're doing this work and you're not talking to kids about this gender-based language that marginalizes gender nonconforming and LGBT, I would argue that you are irrelevant. I like that they're videotaping that. That'll be on YouTube somewhere. Youth who resort to bullying actually escalate to homophobic name-calling as the gender identity is being played out and policing of masculinity. I have pushed and pushed for bullying prevention to include discussion of language around this LGBT issue. This is really challenging, especially if you're developing programs that are commercialized. You want to be able to put it in the conservative neighborhoods. And, you know, as much as I appreciate San Francisco and the openness of San Francisco, that is not where I want to do my work. I want to do my work in that red part of the America, right? And it's challenging. We don't have time for that, but I've been in therapy a long time on this. As you know, right, Wendy? Yeah. And now everybody will know that too on YouTube. They're like, no surprise, explains a lot. So I can continue. So we were funded to then track these kids into high school up through the age of 18. Funded by the National Institutes of Justice because they were starting to really kind of be concerned about what we were seeing in our schools. It was about the same time that we were starting to talk about sexual assault on college campuses. Okay, you probably heard a little rumor that there's sexual assault on college campuses now in the United States. And so this actually showed a full model that family conflict and sibling aggression, which is a strong predictor of bullying perpetration, and child abuse and domestic violence, kind of that ecology that I've talked about, the family dynamic as it plays out in the context of schools, was associated with bullying perpetration. I showed you sexual harassment perpetration, and lo and behold, it predicts in high school teen violence perpetration, teen dating violence perpetration. I tell this story former Vice President Biden, who was the author of our Violence Against Women Act. We still have one of those. And his staffer called me, because the United States government is run by 25-year-old staffers. And this young man called me and he said, Professor Espelage, your report for the National Institutes of Justice indicates and implies that what we're seeing on college campuses happens before they get to college. Yeah. Yep, go ahead and tell Biden that. And I'd like him to write into the bills K through 12. Anyway, such good job security all over the place. And so this really kind of shows that research must consider multiple contexts. If anyone's read our work, homework, and my work of socio-ecological model, we have tried to be pushing those contexts to understand that it's just not the school context, but it's the peers, it's the classrooms, it's the developmental lens. It's understanding that bullying looks different in 4th and 5th grade than it does in middle school, and that we have to consider identity, we have to consider race, we have to consider gender, and the intersectionality of all those things. And I just continue to say bullying prevention programs need to incorporate discussions. Yes, that is a repetition from the last slide. I figured if I just keep saying, maybe it'll stick. A lot of people aren't doing this work. It's very, very challenging. I'm happy to see a couple sessions on this. And so here's the socio-ecological perspective, thousands and thousands of articles written on this. Reality is that we have folks that are operating in silos of the socio-ecological model. So some folks do a really good job over here with the peer networks and the social networks, which are very powerful. Very few researchers in the area of bullying have looked at family dynamics, because that's challenging work to do. Certainly the aggression researchers have done a good job of that. Increasingly, we're looking to the school context, whether it's classroom climate, whether it's school environment. But very few researchers are looking at the overlap across the context, and we're trying to do some of that work. Increasingly, we're seeing more of that, mostly because the statistical techniques are allowing us the better flexibility at looking at the interactions across the systems. Okay, I point out this particular meta-analysis because, one, I just love meta-analysis. Because meta-analysis, you have some speculation and indication based on some certain studies, and then you combine them, and then like truth is seen right there. I point this out because in many of our countries, we're getting mandates to implement across, whether it's kindergarten through the end of high school, whether it's primary to your secondary, that laws are saying you have to have a program in place. Well, they don't know that as developmental psychologists and prevention scientists, we've done a really good job with the little kids. We're struggling with the early adolescents, and we virtually ignored the fact that we have to pay attention to the high school kids and their voice. And we've developed programs with the little kids and just plumped them into the early adolescent context, and that's a problem. What this showed, Clay Cook's work here, was that if you ask kids K through 5, like 5 years to 10 years old, who are the bullies in their classroom and who's popular and who they want to be friends with, they name different people. You get to early adolescence, they name the same people. I didn't say like, I said popular and friends with, right? And so if in fact the process by which and the motivation by which and the underlying of bullying is different in K through 5, and in some ways the peer group through rejection takes care of some of this, yet some of our kids that engage in high rates of bullying in early adolescence are popular and have high social capital and set the tone, your interventions and preventions better be different. We're only now understanding that we have public opinion leaders in middle school and high school that we need to leverage, that have strong leadership skills, and it's 2017. So disappointed in ourselves sometimes. Okay, lots of individual correlates, and we can debate all of these, and we don't have time for that because I am down to like 25 minutes. Okay, the way that I summarize this couple hundred articles is that a healthy family looks like a healthy school. An unhealthy family looks like an unhealthy school. The minute we realize, one, that schools are workplaces that have all the dynamics that go with that, but also when we go into schools and we do large-scale studies, when we find that you have all of these negative things in a school or a family, you have high rates of bullying, you have high rates of teenage pregnancy, you have high rates of alcohol and drug use. When we study turnaround schools and we study, it really comes down to strong leadership. And you can think about your kids and what school do they go to. Is that principal or that leader out there every day shaking hands with kids and naming them by name? Right? Are they dancing? They singing? They going up a rock wall? What are they doing? Right? So we have to think about that the family, we have to see schools as a family sub-context. It really does look like a family when it's operating in that way. And a huge body of literature. We're obsessed with school climate now in the United States, so we're trying to understand what that is, and it's nebulous and it's challenging. I want to just show these few slides. What we've been trying to do is to take new models, ARC models, and try to put within the social ecology, look at the interactions across the different contexts that contributes to bullying perpetration. And then also look at the extent to which either peer characteristics or school characteristics buffer or exacerbate some of these connections between, say, individual characteristics or families and these outcomes. And we do this by kind of looking at both within person, remembering within person, actually if we were developmental psychologists, we should be studying within person, not just between person. And so we have within person and between person, and I could talk a whole semester on this, but essentially what we find is within person peer deviance. So as my own peer delinquency varies within myself, is varied as a function of between-person family violence and individual rates of bullying perpetration over 2 years of middle school. So we have this interaction between family violence and peer deviance. Then we have a significant cross-level interaction that indicates that individuals with higher average rates of family violence had significantly higher rates of bullying perpetration, even at low within-person peer deviance. And you can see why this is challenging to put in for an hour. However, what we find is as my within-person pure deviance increased, rates of bullying perpetration were exacerbated, particularly in individuals with high between-person family violence. And so if in fact, most of our models, we just smush, it's called the smush effect. You've heard this? You smush between person and you're losing a lot of information. Trust me on this, okay? Right. In some ways, and so that was a longitudinal analysis because it's within person, so it's over time. This is a cross-sectional, multi-level way of looking at this to show, and what I want to show you here is what I've plotted is bullying perpetration. At the bottom there, it's low school risk, mean school risk, high school risk. So risky school for us is gang presence, drugs, alcohol, violence, those types of things. And what you see, if you just look at the top line, so as the risky school goes up, and I'm in a high dysfunctional family where there's violence, there's drugs and alcohol, you'll see that bullying perpetration goes up as well. So if in fact you're in a school with low school risk, it buffers the connection between family violence and bullying perpetration. That's what Bronfenbrenner probably wanted us to do, right? To look at the interactions. And I think now, because we have these models, that we can start doing this work. Okay, that lends nicely. So I go from this, like, we need to take into consideration the within person. How do I vary over time, and how does that relate to my bullying perpetration? And how is that predicted by changes in my family dynamic, or changes within the neighborhood, or changes within my peer affiliation? That's a developmental lens. It's not just the basic research of understanding these phenomena where we have to have a developmental lens, but we also have to have a developmental lens, as I was alluding to, when we think about prevention and intervention programs. And so in my studies, I watch teachers implement, because I have a real hard time writing up publications when I cannot imagine what it was like for teachers to engage with the curriculum and the challenges they might have in doing this work. I do a lot of my work in Southside Chicago, very challenging environments. Teachers are under a lot of stress. I watch them. In our first randomized clinical trial, I was noticing that 6th graders, they're very nice. They're like 10 years old. They're very respectful. They go off for the summer. They come back as a 7th grader. They're less respectful. By 8th grade, they don't even say hello to you, you know. And so, but I was noticing that it wasn't the teacher's implementation that was waning. It was the engagement of the kids. So, because I like to call people, I called David Yeager, and you know him. He's Carol Dweck's student, and you know, at one point he'll be his own identity, but he's Carol Dweck's student and does mindset work and brief intervention. And I said, David, are you noticing, like, as the kids are going through your interventions, that something, they're just checking out? Are they over-programmed? I don't know what it is, so we did a meta-analysis, and what we found in the small group of studies that we could that actually had different cohorts of kids so we could look at the age cohort effect, is that bullying perpetration effect size for the bullying prevention programs in 1st grade, so age 6, was 0.20. And many of us in here would just be happy with a 0.20 effect size. As you see, it steadily goes down. Now, remember how I was saying that we are taking a program that's designed for a developmental group of younger kids, and because we're so desperate and there's a legal mandate, that we're putting it in schools with older adolescents. In this particular paper, you'll see it goes down where we have 3 studies down there that are negative, so the bullying perpetration went up. We actually made things worse. We had a recommendation to Congress and Senate and to state districts saying stop mandating K-12 programming until we can figure out what the message should be for 15 to 18-year-olds. And it's not the same message that we give kindergarten through 5. Okay, also in 2011, I think that's when I started my therapy, because we had the Toftian parenting, that was kind of depressing, but the SEL looked really kind of promising too. But at the same time, we had low resources. Many of the things that were on our evidence-based list actually were not producing the results at all, or they weren't sustainable. And so we started to think, a lot of us were starting to think across the world, wait a minute, we've got all of these kind of issues and problem behaviors of kids. Have we kind of lost our understanding of developmental research? And we can go back to Hawkins and Catalano's work, or the theory of problem spectrum behavior, or theory problem behavior, those theories, and say, wait a minute. We know that there are overlapping risk and protective factors for these risky behaviors and these outcomes that we're all measuring. However, we operated in silos, with the exception of me, right? But most of my bully researchers, they only studied bullying, or they studied sexual harassment, or they were teen dating violence. And then Sherry Hamby, so Hamby and John Critch, wrote this beautiful monograph. I encourage you to get it, 2013, that said we need to break down the silos. We need to all recognize that we are talking about some of the same risk and protective factors. Yes, there's certainly unique risk and protective factors associated with gendered, bias-based harassment. But for the most part, we know that if your parents monitor your behavior, that's a good thing. And we've known that for 50 years, right? We also know that if you're in a school that is not affirming of LGBT youth, we know that there's going to be homophobic name calling and it's not going to be a great place for you. Lots of risk and protective factors. So then, from the sky, the Durack meta-analysis fell. And this was critical for us in many, many countries because we were able to say, yes, you'll have less disruptive behavior within the classroom if you're exposed to some type of social-emotional learning. It could be an arts program, it could be a drama program, it could be a full-out curriculum. But the most critical was that if you're in a school where there's exposure, where they're teaching you empathy, perspective taking, conflict management skills, listening skills, all the things that you and I need constantly, that in fact your test scores will be higher. What? Right? This became bipartisan. Both Republicans and Democrats, like, you got to begin. What? If we teach them these basic skills, they're going to have higher test scores? Yes. Game changer, game changer. That's right. So, all of a sudden, we have programs that were supposedly proven to reduce bullying prevention taken off the list because they weren't producing consistent data. There wasn't replication. And then all of a sudden, the federal government said, wait a minute, let's support social-emotional learning, and we're going to give you some money, because this is what we need to do these large-scale studies. All right, I got 15 minutes. All right. I'm just getting going now. See, the jet lag. What jet lag? Okay. So we were funded by the Centers for Disease Control to do an evaluation of the middle school years, so from 10 to 12, so 6th through 8th grade. And this was particularly focused on, I'm going to talk about 7, not cherry-picked. I got 7 outcomes for you. This was funded by CDC because of their focus on sexual violence, sexual harassment, very much concerned. CDC is a public health agency, so they understand sexual violence and the importance of studying this. They're not that much interested in bullying. But we measured physical fighting, bullying, we measured victimization, homophobic name-calling, victimization, perpetration, and sexual harassment, victimization, perpetration. Keep those 7 outcomes in your head, okay? Because it hasn't been a long enough day. And so it's always nice when you do these randomized clinical trials and then you can summarize it in like 7 slides, right? All the work that goes into this, and it comes down to effect size. So we evaluated Second Step. No investment in Second Step developed by a committee for children. However, we were looking for a program that was social-emotional connection. Of course, it was a social-emotional learning program. We didn't want just a program that was just all around bullying, because the kids had told us in focus groups that, one, they could define bullying, and they could do it right in front of the No Bully Zone poster, right? They've heard about it. They know all about bullying. They wanted more. The teachers wanted more. And because of the Durack meta-analysis, we really wanted to look at and evaluate a program with social-emotional learning. We also wanted one that really targeted the risk and protective factors that we knew would reduce victimization as well as perpetration. We also needed something that was scripted. Let me enlighten you a little bit. Not all of our teachers are good group facilitators. Okay? That's why social workers want to implement all these programs, but the reality is social workers can't give a lesson 30 times in a week and still be enthusiastic about this, right? And so we have teachers that are brilliant facilitators, and they're not going to go from the script. So this all gets to the implementation stuff that we've been talking about, right? And so, but then you also have that math teacher that's been told they're going to do Second Step, and their facilitation skills are not that strong, and they need that script, right? And so this program could be implemented in an advisory period, so that was important for us too. Okay, so very fortunate when I did this randomized clinical trial both in Illinois and Kansas, and that's going to be important, 2 states there right in the middle of the United States, is that the social-emotional learning standards that are in many of the countries that we see came out of Chicago and out of Roger Weisberg's Consortium of Academic Social-Emotional Learning. And so because many of you may not live, eat, and breathe social-emotional learning, The goals of this is really to develop self-awareness and self-management skills to achieve school and life goals. So that means understanding one's own emotions and behaviors, understanding my own personal qualities and external supports that I might have, and demonstrating skills related to achieving personal and academic goals. In addition to this, there's this other component of understanding social awareness and interpersonal skills to maintain healthy relationships. And again, a lot of this talk should be an entire semester long. We don't have that time. But it's more than kumbaya, right? So oftentimes politicians think that this is like brainwashing our children to develop life skills, like somehow, really. And so we have to talk about, this is the idea of really giving ownership and agency to kids to make positive decisions in their lives and to be ethical and contribute to the school community. So lots of conversations about consider ethical, safety, and societal factors, applying decision makings to deal responsibly with ours, and really contributing to the well-being of one's schools and community. As I said, it's based on risk and protective factors literature, little bit on bullying, lots on brain research. When we talk to kids about getting angry, they learn about the neuroscience behind that within the program. There's a positive approach. We're just not pointing at kids, but we're actually trying to give them skills. And then the development, it was really developmentally grounded within the context of what we know about early adolescence and the way in which, one, they engage with curriculum, two, the ways in which bullying displays itself. Okay, so grade 6, grade 7, grade 8, there's 15 lessons or 50 minutes each. Grade 7, we introduced sexual harassment and gender-based harassment. Grade 7 and 8, we also introduced alcohol and drug prevention strategies, which is important to us. Our kids that are chronically victimized by age 10 and 11 are starting to cope through drugs and alcohol and marijuana, because we legalize that in our country. And so we're very much concerned about the early onset because that predicts issues. So this is a nested cohort design where we tracked 6th graders across 3 years. So by the end of this, when I couldn't sleep at night, when you do randomized clinical trials, you don't sleep very well at night, right? Especially in the US, because they close schools and they go on strike and they do all kinds of things. And then principals say, we don't want to do this anymore. And so when I wake up like sweating, I say, wait a minute. They've had 41 lessons of social-emotional learning. Something should move. Okay, so here we went and we recruited 36 schools in Illinois and Kansas. We matched them, we randomly assigned, 18 got second step, 18 got business as usual, which is usually PBIS in our context. And so we tracked these kids over time. There's about 3,700 6th graders that we tracked over time, year 1, year 2, and year 3. There was 4 assessments. Teachers, I insisted that teachers implement this program because I believe that teachers are lacking in their own social-emotional learning. And there is some research, a number of research that's actually showing that. And they're in a high-stress environment, and so it may be beneficial for them to do this. And plus, when social workers and school psychologists do these programs, they pick 5 lessons out of the 15, 3 lessons here. I've heard this in a number of the sessions here. They pick these programs. That's not how it was developed. That's not how it was intended to be implemented. If you're doing that, just don't do the program at all. And so we had teachers implement, we had them do implementation logs. So we asked them, how much of the lesson did you do? What did you leave out? And we allowed them to leave stuff out because sometimes they just having a good conversation, they wouldn't finish the lesson. And I'll get to some other issues there. We actually asked them about how they prepared the lesson. Did they do it in a group? Did they engage with it like they would their academic content? How much money did they spend? How much time did they do the lesson? How many minutes did they prep? Were the kids engaged? You can't really do this work without implementation data anymore, right? We used to just kind of collect that, saying that we collected and never really look at it. This is very important. I'm going to show you. I'm glad that we collected it. Okay, year 1, out of the gate. Remember, we have those 7 outcomes, right? Fighting, bullying, victimization, peer victimization. That's not gender-based, homophobic name-calling, and sexual harassment. Out of the gate, after 15 weeks, we reduced physical fighting, throwing punches by 42%. And yes, there's fights in the schools that I work in Southside Chicago. This is important in the context of our Healthy People 2020, which we're in 2017. Our goal was to reduce physical fighting on school property by 3%. We reduced it by 42% simply by talking to kids about empathy, perspective taking, listening skills, communication, emotion regulation. All those things that we know promote healthy relationships and resolving of conflicts. Pretty proud of that finding. Year 2, that's right. Year 2, we got a state effect. So I never know exactly how to say this, but in year 2, because remember I said at the beginning that most of my work is connected social-politically in the context of the states. In the state of Kansas, and I always say that I can talk about Kansas because my name is Dorothy and I was victimized because of it. They had a bill that passed, and the bill was that if you owned a company and someone walked in your company and you suspected they were gay, you could ask them to leave. And that passed. So you can imagine what happened at the dinner tables in Wichita, Kansas, where we're talking about sexual harassment and gender-based harassment and, LGBT issues when they're sitting at dinner and I'm like, hey, we talked about sexual harassment and that LGBT youth are at risk. And then there's the news in Wichita, Kansas that said, bill passed. You can refuse service to LGBT or gender nonconforming people in Wichita, Kansas. Yeah, this is real, people. What you put in place in Kansas and Nebraska is going to look very different than San Francisco and Boston and New York. Okay. However, Kansas, they made me happy when I meta-analyzed the implementation data. So Josh Plannon, who's a meta-analyst and former undergrad of mine that's just rocking it out on the meta-analytic world, he said, I have this new technique. And I was like, what is it? And he was like, let's meta-analyze the implementation data. And we found reductions in all 7 forms of aggression, victimization, and perpetration, when in fact, the teachers were given time to prep the lesson. They invested their additional financial resources. And if you know teachers, you know they do. And they get a tax break for it. They consulted others, so they actually engaged with the curriculum like they would in academic content. This was fabulous, because implementation matters, but this shows quantitatively that the effect sizes were through the roof when ultimately the administrator gave the teachers the time and encouraged them to engage in the curriculum like they would an academic curriculum. So when we followed this up, I'm down to 5 minutes. Yeah, I know, I'll see it over there. I got it. When we followed up, we did a gender-enhanced randomized clinical trial that we just finished, and this is where we gave all the schools second step, all 28 of the schools in Southside Chicago, and then half the schools we sat down with the teachers and talked to them about their responsibility to protect LGBT youth, and Title IX, which is sexual harassment, and did all that kind of training with them and talked to them about gender and get them to understand the difference between gender and sex and cisgender and transgender and this, which makes their head just explode, right? And the 20 other terms they need to know. What we did in every one of those 28 schools, I had an implementation meeting with the principal and with the teachers that were implementing. And I showed them the meta-analysis. I said, if you want the reductions, so I empowered the teachers and the administrator to say, if you want these results and outcomes, let's engage with this social-emotional learning beyond a 50-minute lesson on Tuesday morning. Okay. Open the black box, which we are starting to do, right? So we can have all these outcomes. The federal agency's always like, did you reduce bullying and sexual violence? Well, sometimes you don't. And sometimes you do under some circumstances, and sometimes you want to understand how you did it. Well, in year 3, we had reductions in all forms, including cyber. This is where we added our cyber outcomes. But we had it through a mediating effect of decrease in delinquency. Pretty fabulous. Our schools were very happy that they're decrease in delinquency. We also, this was the first randomized clinical trial that actually included students with disabilities for social-emotional learning. The United States, as big as it is. I was running a search, and I called my former student, Chad Rose, who studies students with disabilities and bullying, and I said, okay, let me just check this. And my guys did all these searches, and there's not a single randomized clinical trial of social-emotional learning with students with disabilities. He said, you are absolutely right. This is the first one. Because oftentimes they don't include the students with disabilities in the randomized clinical trial. So every one of these 36 principals said to me, but do you want the students in special ed? I said, yeah, I do. Well, you know it's going to take them longer to get through the curriculum. I was like, okay. We also get disability data, and what you're seeing here is a prevention effect. So if you're a student with disability in second step, your bullying perpetration flatlined. And what we've heard at this conference is what we know in ages 10 through 12, bullying perpetration increases. We had a prevention effect here. This is pretty powerful. What I don't show here in a follow-up publication 2016 is the kids in special ed that were in a second step school had a higher, one entire whole letter grade higher on their report card after the 3 years. And you don't have to be in special education to understand that if you get somebody from a D to a C in special ed, that's pretty darn significant. That's halfway back to their mainstream classroom. Okay. All right, that all well said, and I'm going to try to wrap this up quickly. When I interviewed 36 principals, I saw 36 different school environments. So keeping with the theme, I called CDC and I said, I need $50,000 more. I got to do a school environment survey. And I said to my GA, and I said, I think I know where it's going to work. And he's like, well, why are we doing this? And I was like, I don't know. Scientifically, I just think I know where it's going to work because the environment is such that there's going to be investment in the program. There's going to be fidelity in implementation, and that's going to contribute to our outcomes. So we went and we surveyed. So this is School Climate Matters, and Stephanie Cason's written about this. Dan Olveus had a nice paper in 1998. So I apologize, Dan, that it's not on there. I'll add it. So we talked to about 1,400, and we surveyed 1,400 teachers, administrators, one school bus driver, and one cafeteria worker wanted to really tell us what they thought about the school. And we asked them about, do students intervene around violence and bullying? Does staff intervene? Is there aggression a problem? Do you feeling supported by your administrator to do this work? Is there a kumbaya positive school climate? And of course, no, you guys have now known me for 59 minutes. So of course, I asked gender equity and intolerance of sexual harassment, because remember, it happens. Okay, this is the final multi-level model. What you're going to see is the covariates and all of the teacher level data, staff level data over there. The second column is the student bullying perpetration, peer victimization, physical aggression, and willingness to intervene. Okay, if in fact the teachers feel that aggression is a problem in their schools, the kids say, I'm not intervening to help victims. This is the cart before the horse. Many of our schools want to talk about upstander to bystander to allies. We have all kinds of terms. We have bystander revolution. We got it. We got One Direction telling us how to do this. We got the Kardashians telling us how to do this. Ariana Grande clearly really doesn't want to talk about bullying. She didn't bring those tickets over here yet. And so we have to think about, the kids are not going to intervene if they feel unsafe. Okay, next thing. If in fact the teachers say, hold on, I feel supported by these administrators. They might not be doing things perfectly, but I feel supported. We have opportunities to have these discussions. There's less bullying, there's less victimization, and less physical aggression. These are multi-level models with a lot of covariates. It's not easy to get this to work. Okay, look at that. If in fact you're intolerant of sexual harassment, there's less bullying and less peer victimization. Because if you were paying attention, a lot of the bullying and peer victimization is gender-based, and it's related to sexual harassment. And I put this up here mostly because Sarah Reinhardt, who's now going to be a PhD next week, is from Minnesota. And when the church people come over on Sunday, this publication is on the wall, right? Because that's her grandbaby that had a publication. I think she probably crosses out homophobic name-calling, but we found also that when the staff are intolerant of sexual harassment and they promote gender equity, whatever that looks like within the context of that school, there's less homophobic name-calling and less sexual harassment. So school climate matters. So when we're thinking about the ecology, and I kind of took out all my peer work here because you guys you've heard from some of the leaders within peer dynamics and social networks to know that that's also important, and certainly peers drive homophobic name-calling and bullying perpetration as well. So prevention programs yield reductions in bullying and victimization and gender-based harassment if implemented with fidelity. It appears that the effects are strongest for the younger kids. However, we have a meta-analysis that showed bystander intervention programs are more effective for the older kids. And then staff, it matters, and I will fight, and that's why we have so many publications, because we have to fight against the non-evidence, the non-scientific community that's really pushing the programs into our schools. What are we doing next? As I alluded to, we've developed a text messaging program called Bully Down, and that's for 7th graders. It's a 7.5-week program, and we're trying to get funding from NIH there to do an RCT. I said that I did the gender enhanced, trying to push that envelope a little bit more around gender issues. We're also recognizing that in our high schools we have other issues. We have a suicide rate that's pretty high, so we're launching a Sources of Strength RCT in our high schools, where we're using peer leaders and talking to them about the importance of connections and relationships and help seeking, and getting them to create a norm in the high schools where it's okay to ask for help when you're depressed, anxious, isolated, and suicidal. In addition, we were given $7 million from NIJ to do school safety framework, where we're developing an app so kids can report issues that they have, emotional and physical safety, as well as getting resources. And we're also doing restorative solving problem and justice. Restorative justice is difficult. I'm in a high school now, we're in year 2, and we're still struggling to get this up and running. So this is not simple. And so also student-led campaigns. So more and more we're arguing, where many of you have done this in this conference, which I appreciate, youth voice, student campaigns, especially ages 15 through 18. They know what's happening and is going on in the schools, and they'll be the first to sabotage anything that we do that is adult-driven. And so we need to continue to have that focus, take a developmental lens, and recognize that this is important work. The next steps. Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you very, very much for this speed date.
Yeah, because you might not invite me back.
Fabulous.
You know? Yeah.
Very interesting to hear. And it's our little gratitude
Yes.
for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
And now you can go to Ariana and listen to her.
Yeah, she probably didn't even retweet me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yep.
This was the last session for tonight. And we will see you in the morning again for a new key session. So thank you very much.